The Soviet Union was big. Like, really, really big. In fact, it was so big that if you were to squash the planet Pluto down with a large rolling pin and lay it out flat, it would only be about 2/3 the size. And likewise, if you were to do the same to Earth's moon, the USSR would be around 60% of its entire surface area. Today, this mammoth nation is no longer with us and instead separated into 15 independent republics. These republics are the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan. In addition to this, there were also countries, whilst technically independent, that were heavily under the Soviet sphere of influence and members of the defence alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. These were Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. So yeah, the Soviet Union itself was ginormous, and along with its close allies was certainly a force to be reckoned with. But rather than looking into the typically studied history of the Soviet Union with its great purges, patriotic wars, its gulags and close calls with the West, we're instead going to look into the people of the country. Just who were the Soviets and what did they look like? What was the demographic makeup of the nation, and how did its population change over time? To begin this study, let's look at the population figure as a whole. The last Soviet census taken in 1989 recorded that 286,730,819 people lived within the country, of whom a slight majority, 51% or 147.4 million people, lived in the Russian SFSR. In second place was the Ukrainian SSR with 51.7 million, and third the Uzbek SSR with 19.9 million. At the time, the two smallest of the republics were Latvia and Estonia, with only 2.6 and 1.5 million people respectively. And if we look in terms of the cities, Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, were the two largest urban areas with 9 and 5 million people within their boundaries. Being such a colossal country also meant that the Soviet Union was very diverse in terms of the ethnicity and national background of its people. The largest ethnic group of the USSR throughout its history were Russians, who reached an estimated population of 145 million in 1989, or just over 50% of the total countrywide figure. In second place were Ukrainians at 44 million and third Uzbeks at 15 million. Two interesting points to add here is that firstly there was a large figure of 35 million people who were simply listed as others, likely comprised of many Eurasian minority groups from across the nation. And secondly, that the Tatars, who numbered around 6 million people, were the largest ethnic group not to have their own distinct republic. The first census taken in the USSR was in 1926, 4 years after its founding. By comparing the first and last census figures for population, we can see that the numbers rose quite staggeringly, in fact almost doubling in size. The numbers from the first census showed that 147 million people lived within the USSR, 100 million in Russia, 28 million in Ukraine, 5 million in Belarus, with the remainder coming from the Central Asian republics. It's important to add here for context that the Baltic nations of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia weren't annexed into the Soviet Union until 1940 and therefore not present in the first two censuses of 1926 and 1939. By 1939, the population of the USSR had risen to 168 million and over the following decades would reach 180 million in 1950, 241 million in 1970, 262 million in 1979 and eventually surpassing 290 million in the early 90s. The ethnic composition also shifted over time, with the Eastern Slavic group comprised of Russians, Belarusians and Ukrainians jumping from 113 million in 1926, or 77% of the population, to 200 million in 1989 and 70% of the population. The Central Asian group too rose from 10 million people in the first census to over 34 million by the last, increasing their share of the total USSR population from 7% to 12% over time. The same trend was also seen in the Caucasus, with a population growth from 5 million to 15 million, and similarly in the Baltics, with a small increase from 4 million in 1940 to 5.5 million in 1990. The last aspect of life to look into is religion, which was certainly a difficult and controversial affair in the Soviet Union. In the early years of the new USSR, the elimination of religion was heavily promoted, with the state goal being that the Leninist Marxist ideology should replace any previously held beliefs. Worshippers were strictly persecuted in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, with many churches, mosques and other places of worship either falling into disrepair, changing into another type of establishment, or in some cases being destroyed entirely. Despite the heavy-handed persecution in the first few decades, religion, as is always the case, did survive and eventually go on to be more accepted as time passed. By the end of the 1980s, as many as 1/3 of all people in the USSR professed religious beliefs, and of this figure, around 20% followed the Russian Orthodox Church, 15% believed in Islamic faiths, 7% belonged to other Christian groups, and 1% were practicing Jews. The landmasses of Earth that host our nations changed drastically over time, and with it, so too did the people. The Soviet Union was the largest ever country on Earth, and its people extremely diverse. Whilst it is no longer here today, the echoes and imprints left behind by this once Leviathan nation still resonates in the modern-day states of Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, and 11 other republics. Its legacy and impact will be felt for generations to come, and the effect it had in one small pinprick of human history ripples throughout the world today. I mean, some of the main reasons for the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war right now are the core issues of ethnicity, borders, territory, identity, and language, among a host of other problems. In other words, problems that ultimately stem from the people of the region. Today's video was certainly different than normal, so I hope you enjoyed or found some interest in this historical demographic look into Soviet history. Of course, I could have gone on to talk about more stats in regards to Soviet society, but I think what's been said here already should paint a clear enough picture of who the people were and what they looked like on the surface. And with that being said, I'll leave it here. Thank you as always to all viewers and subscribers, and I'll see you next time.